broken, so you put a new one in here, but it does the same thing. So we're going to have a gooseneck love affair here. There you go. All right. All right. I hope everybody can hear me. All right. To this, I wish this were, I might have to work from here. First of all, I am not a trained leader in the ethical movement, ethical culture movement. For those of you who are new, a leader is essentially a humanist minister. But I've been a member of this society since the early 1990s. I've been to a number of assemblies and heard a number of lectures and talks about the 8 core principles of ethical culture. So I wanted to give this talk to let you know what I know and have a discussion following this. So the resources I've used in this, normally you would do this at the end, but I wanted to let you know it ahead of time. It's from the AEU website about humanism. There's a booklet called A Concept Map for Ethical Culture towards Philosophical Consensus. It was published in 1991 by the Leaders Council, and it contains in it a reference to the 1912 principles that various AEU leaders and the leader of the British Ethical Society came together to write. There's also, and the AEU website lists Lois Kellerman, leader emeritus of the Brooklyn Society for Ethical Culture, as a person who pulled together these 8 commitments of ethical culture. And in fact, she's not contemporary of me. I think she's a little bit older than I am, but she actually trained me when I was learning how to do humanist weddings. And so I think she's still alive. So this is relatively recent as opposed to something that was written 100 years ago. There are some other citations down here where I found some quotes that I used in the talk. Core values versus creed. Creed is typically defined as an authoritative formula of religious belief, a set of fundamental beliefs, Merriam-Webster. The American Ethical Union states, and the American Ethical Union is our national organization of which we're a part. It states that ethical humanism, AKA ethical culture, has no creed or dogma. So then we get to the point of, well, if we don't have a creed, what are our core values, our principles, our commitments? So we're going to go over that today. These values, commitments, principles are not really unique to ethical humanism, but are in common with humanism as articulated by the organizations such as the American Humanist Association. That's one of the problems when you're a member of an organization like this, the broader humanist movement, is that there's no one creed that's going to save you. But again, I'm going over this today so people will know what the core principles in ethical humanism, ethical culture are. Okay, the founder of ethical culture is Felix Adler. And this is him when he was somewhat of a young man. I forget, he may have even been in his 20s. Felix Adler's vision for what became ethical culture was a religion based on ethics and ethical living rather than religion as the basis of belief. His philosophical leanings were greatly influenced by Immanuel Kant, and Adler struggled, in my opinion, to expand Kant's philosophy, but in so doing, his words often became difficult to understand. And this was the 1870s, people spoke differently than they do today. And so a lot of people have written about Felix Adler, modern Felix Adler, how would he say these things? And so I think, again, this talk will attempt to clarify some of the basic values that he elucidated. There are some memorable quotes, though, and I'll go over that first. Deed before creed is something you'll often hear in ethical culture societies, as well as diversity in creed, unanimity in deed. What we do to make our culture more ethical, our society more ethical, is critical, and what people believe about ultimate reality God or gods is a matter of personal choice. So you don't hear people talking about God in our organizations. We're talking about ethical choices people make and what society's problems are, but there's not really any God talk. Act so as to elicit the best in others and thereby in oneself. This link between the welfare of others and that of one's own well-being is in contrast to philosophies that talk about self-enlightenment or individual salvation. So we have to do something with other people to enhance their lives, and we thereby enhance ours. A human being is not to be handled as a tool, but is to be respected and revered. Humans should be treated as ends in themselves, not a means to an end. And that's directly from Felix. There are other worthy quotes that we can review through the previously cited URLs. And another thing to note too, for those of you who are visiting, Felix Adler was the founder of ethical culture, but Felix Adler is not our God. Felix Adler is not the beginning and end of all not revelation of knowledge. We have other sources that we use to guide us. And so again, I'm talking about what's in the past and then what's in the present. And there is a relationship between the past and present. Okay, from the principles of union, there were 9 principles written and published by several AEU leaders, lay leaders. They were Howard Bridges, Stanton Coit, George Odell, and Harry Snell of the British Ethical Union. Yes, there was actually an ethical union in Britain called the British Ethical Union. It doesn't exist now, but that's another story. The 9th principle was a statement about what ethical fellowship is and the reason that ethical culture societies exist. So you could say there were 8 core principles in these 9. And I'm going to highlight some of those in my talk today. There's not a one-to-one correlation between these 9 principles and the 8 commitments of ethical culture, but there are quite a few tie-ins. And this is just it came out blurry on my screen at home. And I just wanted to put this up here just so you see that this thing really exists. I don't think we have any extra copies of the where this came from, which is the concept map. But I'll look for them, and if we do have them, I'm trying to make them available at a future date. This is the 9 that I'm referring to, just for reference purposes here. One interesting thing about the American Ethical Union's website, and its listing about humanism, it first lists what do we teach, and then it lists what our core principles are. So these things that we teach actually seem to be a compression, a distilling of the 8 into 5. So I'll go over those briefly here. Freedom of belief. When we stimulate our thinking about new insights and inspirations, our understanding of the world evolves, and we realize the full capacity of our human spirit. So again, they're not talking about gods and about supernatural things. They're talking about new insights and inspirations. Eliciting the best. You already heard Felix Adler's quote about bringing out the best in other people. So respect for human worth. That is one of the core principles of ethical culture, ethical humanism. We treat all people as having an inherent capacity for fairness, truthness, and living ethically. Then ethical living itself. When we put into practice our ethical principles such as love, justice, beauty, and forgiveness, we experience harmony within ourselves and our relationships. Again, that linkage between what you do to help other people and your own well-being. And reverence for life. We cultivate the spiritual dimension of life by experiencing our independent connections to humanity, nature, and our inner values. Again, no supernaturalism here, no theism. Doesn't mean that you can't be a theist and be a member of ethical culture here. It just means that these are things that we teach. We're very much based on naturalism, and that we have all evolved from a natural process as opposed to being created. So the 8 commitments of ethical culture, again, it's sort of a repeat here, was an attempt to pull together the shared principles that characterize the movement of the societies in the AEU. Again, it was created out of a dialogue, whereas the 9 principles that I referenced came out of just some leaders who did this work and published it. These 8 commitments really were the work more collaborative between Lois Kellerman and the AEU and the member society. She was really trying to get something that captured the spirit of what ethical culture is about. Let's see, the AEU lists these commitments under what are some principles of an ethical society. They're meant to be descriptive rather than proscriptive, but I guess you could argue either way. But my point is, no one's expected to memorize these, to recite these, or to say, I believe every one of these things 100%. Again, this is, if we are religious, we're not religious in that way. Again, we don't have a creed. Okay, what's the first one? Ethics is central. So when I reference the AEU, I'm really referring to the 8 commitments of ethical culture as on the website. So here you see the central human issue in our lives is creating a more humane environment. From the 1912 principles, it states, in relations of life, the moral factor should be the supreme consideration. Another version of this that I first came across is ethics is central. I prefer this version for one, because it's central. It is the central organizing principle of ethical culture, ethical humanism. And note, this statement is not a matter of academic interest. We don't go around studying different ethical systems and say this one's better than that one. Some people who have come here sort of expected that, but we as ethical culturists, those who are willing to, not willing to, but who feel these values deeply, we are pursuing it more as a life focus as opposed to an academic analysis. The use of environment here in the first statement, to me, doesn't really get at what we are. The culture really does. We're trying to change the culture. We're trying to change the society. So we don't really study environmental issues. We're not an environmental lobby group, although there has been criticism that we focus too much on human beings. But I think the whole, all the member societies, all the people in it realize the importance of addressing climate change and how we are part of a larger environment. Ethics begins with choice. Creating a more humane environment begins by affirming the need to make significant choices in our lives, again, from the 8 commitments. From the 1912 principles, the individual considers the choices of others with one's final authority upon any opinion or action to be in his or her own conscientious and reasoned judgment. Ethical culture, ethical humanism rejects times which hold that we do not have a choice in how we respond to life and its challenges. Definitely not deterministic. And I was hoping to provide a quote, but I couldn't find it. So I used this one instead, which is pretty much the same as what I have read that Stephen Hawking said, but I couldn't find the exact citation. Since neither determinism nor free will can be proved as a fact, pragmatic humanism must assert that every person has a moral responsibility for his or her actions. Any other course is bound to have disastrous social consequences. And this is from an article in The Humanist from 2014. So again, we're right up there with core humanist values. We choose to treat each other as ends and not means. To enable us to be whole in a fragmented world, we choose to treat each other as unique individuals having intrinsic worth. And then from the 9 principles, love of goodness and of one fellows are the motives for the right conduct, the true motives. Note that the operative word here in the AEU statement is choose. It is an act of will. It is not a belief in something innate in a human being, in their so-called spirit. It's not a matter of proving philosophical truth or ascribing worth based on, again, a supernatural endowment. It's a choice that we make. As a choice, we should choose, should we choose not to attribute intrinsic worth to another human being? If we do, then I did find this quote from Nietzsche, then we can more easily justify deeds that have questionable moral authority. For example, Nietzsche warned us, whoever fights monsters should see to it that in the process, one does not become a monster. We seek to act with integrity, treating one another as ends. Treating another as ends requires that we learn to act with integrity. This includes keeping commitments, being honest and open, caring, and responsive. The 1912 principles, interestingly enough, don't address this specifically. This commitment pertains to individual ethical actions as opposed to what needs to be done in a larger community to make it better. It is actually not often stressed in ethical culture societies, the personal side of this, but I think it's sort of baked into the whole process. You know, if you're going to do these things I've talked about so far, if you're not acting with integrity, if you're acting as though you don't really believe those things, then you've fallen into the hypocrisy that I think most of us have turned away from and that most people would eschew. We are committed to educate ourselves. Personal progress is possible, both in wisdom and in social life. Learning how to build ethical relationships and cultivate a humane community is a lifelong endeavor. Elements of the 9 principles also echo this. For example, the 3rd says knowledge of the right has been evolving. That means the right thing to do, the concept of the good life has been evolving, it's been changing. The 6th principle states the scientific method should be applied in studying the facts of moral life. As subtext to each one of these, I forget which one's which, the additional subtext were, we build on the past, but we move beyond the past. So the past is not rock solid, that's all we believe in, it's all in the past. It's something that happens in the future as well. Our knowledge is expanding. Anyone who knows science knows that knowledge is expanding. So we have to change some of our attitudes, some of our thinking about how the world works and our understanding of it based on that. So again, this is a journey, not a point of enlightenment that someone attains. Next, self-reflection and our social nature require us to shape a more humane world. Growth of the human spirit is rooted in self-reflection, but it can only come to full flower in community. This is because people are social, needing both primary relationships and larger supportive groups to become fully human. I won't read the rest. The well-being of society requires economic and other conditions that afford the largest scope for moral development for all of its members, the 1912 principle. Also, the 7th principle from 1912 about acceptance of religion or belief in any deity contains this comment. The concept of the good life finds its origin in nature of human beings as social and rational beings. 7, democratic process is essential to our task. Again, the democratic process is essential to a humane social order because it reflects, because of the respect for the worth of persons requires a democratic process, which elicits and allows greater expression of human capacities. Again, the 1912 principles don't explicitly talk about democratic process, but given all the preceding commitments, it's hard to imagine that someone would say, we believe in these things, but we believe in an absolute authority, or we believe that there's only one person who's enlightened enough to tell us what we need to do. So democratic process. And as an expansion of democratic process, the AEU and a lot of its proceedings use consensus. And I don't know if you know what consensus is, it may seem obvious, but consensus is a method by which any one person can stop so for example, we've had votes here that have been some controversial on different ethical resolutions. We had a 2/3 majority rule that 2/3 of the majority had to vote in favor of for it to pass. Well, things failed, but people were still very upset and concerned that something might pass that doesn't reflect their own core values. And I'm thinking, well, maybe we should change that to be done by consensus. So any one person could block consensus, and that's sort of would get us around the tyranny of the majority, as they say. Consensus is one way of valuing everybody's opinion. Life itself inspires a natural religious response. Number 8, although the awareness of impending death intensifies the human quest, the mystery of life itself and the need to belong are the primary factors motivating human religious response. This is probably the most humanistic part of the 8 commitments in terms of being sort of almost a rejection of gods, of theism, of other ways of thinking. Several principles in 1912 from 1912 address the role of the supernatural in ethical culture, and I'm going to reference one part of that. The moral life involves neither acceptance nor rejection of any belief, a belief in any deity, personal or impersonal, or any life after death. So yes, life itself inspires a natural religious response, but the moral search for ethical living, the moral life, doesn't involve acceptance or rejection. So so it's sort of a little bit of fence straddling, but it really focuses on the ethics of what we try to focus on, as opposed to what someone believes about ultimate reality or about the presence of gods or other things. So the future. One of the things that I think ethical humanism has to offer is its freedom to adapt to a world that changes. One of the questions I want to ask of you today is, what would you add or change to these values? What would you keep? And of course, I love this. The St. Louis Society, their Facebook page had this quote from Eleanor Roosevelt that I really like. One's philosophy is not best expressed in words. It is expressed in the choices one makes. So again, the focus on integrity, of doing the right thing, is what binds us together. So with that said, I will open this up to our moderator, or we just go straight into questions from the audience. So. Thank you. I see someone back there. So sure, yes. Yeah.
So we'll have questions in a minute, and just to go over the ground rules for the Q&A, raise your hand, wait for the microphone, ask only one question at a time, and wait until everyone has had a chance to ask at least one question before you ask another. So our collection baskets are being passed around, and our society is an all-volunteer organization. We receive no money from any other organizations. We survive due to your commitment to our common goals, that together we can continue to provide a place where ethics and shaping a more caring and thoughtful world is our ultimate concern. So we pass the basket, and thank you for your generous contributions. So Chris, how are we going to do Q&A? Are you going to stand?
Yeah, I'll stand there. And if you could pass the mic over.
I see Charles has a question right off the bat, so why don't we start back there? Oh, it's Kent, excuse me.
Maybe not exactly a question, but a question and statement. I listened to all that, and I'm so glad when you paused, you said, as my generation, you were tends to do, because I've seen evolution, I think more among young people that say, you know, and my reaction is no, I might not know, I might not agree. It assumes consensus, and it attempts to cut off, in my mind, debate about, do I know that or not? Now, you said at one point, I think, and that's fine. And you said science is expanding, you know, and I probably agree with that. But the phrase, you know, just seems to me to be a little coercive.
I think you've got something there. I've stumped y'all.
Another question?
First of all, I enjoyed your talk. Thank you. But one of the, I think maybe it was principle number 2. One of the phrases I hate most in current speaking is the idea of it is what it is, because that's just to me, a major cop-out. And it doesn't take proper responsibility. And I appreciate this sort of point of view a lot better. So just a comment.
All right. Thank you. Amy had her hand up.
Oh, Amy.
This is just a small history comment. And you touched on it briefly, but these 8 commitments didn't sift down from above. These are things that we worked on in the late 90s. I think every ethical culture community discussed them and adopted them as a community effort.
That's something I found Lois Kellerman on Facebook and tried to engage her, but she was either not responding for whatever reason, because she actually had trained me. So I reminded her that she trained me as a humanist efficient, but that didn't seem to rouse her interest. So I was really wanting to know when she did these, but I would accept the 90s or early 90s. So.
Excuse me, Chris, as something you put up there is about consensus as opposed to majoritarianism. Now, the thing of consensus is that if, let us say that you have one person who does not believe and 20 others do, but that one person is able to impose their will, then that is not ethical either. Then 20 other people are forced to go along with something that they don't believe.
Well, again, the consensus idea is to not alienate anybody. In consensus, people can choose to stand aside. That's the third option. You can vote in favor. You can say I block consensus. You can say I stand aside, meaning I'm not going to support this, but I'm not going to prevent it from happening. Again, you could even argue that consensus is not democratic because the majority is not being followed. But in an effort to, again, make everyone feel included, there are certain times I think that it's appropriate. Again, there's times when you have to vote on something and make a commitment, and standing still is not possible. Such as the time when we decided we had to move from one place to the other. We didn't have much choice about that. So that's an example, but I hear what you're saying. Yeah.
Yeah, just to further clarify, if you block consensus, it's because you cannot live with what is being proposed. It's kind of anyway, very extreme. So as Chris said, if you stand aside, essentially you're abstaining, but you're allowing the business to go on. The idea is if someone's blocking consensus, then you get together and put your heads together until you can come up with something that will work for everyone. And as it works in the AU Assembly, after I think 3 chances to reach consensus, then they go to a voting model in order not to hold up the whole works.
Yeah, when we elect the different ethical the AEU officers, it's usually done outright from a democratic vote majority rule, as opposed to trying to find consensus. So I agree. Sometimes you have to be judicious about when you are going to use consensus and when it's not appropriate. Yes, Jennifer.
So I just wanted to comment on, I think it was 7 or 6 about basically how you grow within the community. Yes, you can flower in the community and using self-reflection. I would hope that this is something that is pushed more by the ethical union because of how much social isolation has been a root of a lot of trouble that we've had lately and for decades, especially with people who were younger, because I don't think that that's what a lot of young people realize, that they need to grow. People kind of live in echo chambers and in their own head, and they forget that the part of how you grow is because you get that feedback from someone who supports you and cares for you honestly. And it's not so much what you kind of make up in your head. So I appreciate that that's there, and hopefully we'll see more of it.
Well, we tend to be left of center just by virtue of the type of people we attract. But we've had our disagreements, and not everybody thinks the same way. We're not marching in lockstep. When you get a bunch of liberals together, you're going to have disagreements. So, that's, and I've learned a lot from people who had views that I didn't have initially. So it's a way we grow. Yeah. Yes, Judith.
I just wanted to make one comment about consensus. And I think that if it's going to be consensus, the issue is it needs to be consensus of everybody having a chance to hear the information instead of something like 2/3 of the people present.
Yeah.
Because not everybody can be present and hear everything at all.
Yeah.
And so that was one thing I think is important, because I've been in different groups where it's 2/3 of the people present, but that's not fair if everybody hasn't heard the information and had a chance to weigh in on a big decision,
Yeah.
a policy or something.
Yeah,
That's all.
That's true.
Hello.
Hello.
My question, listening to the consensus discussion, what occurred to me is how does trust factor into the ethical commitments? For example, in the discussion of consensus, I would imagine the notion would be is that any individual who has an issue, you have to trust that they're coming from a place of being ethical. And they in turn have to trust that the group itself is coming from a place of being ethical. So the question that came to me is that in relation to the individuals and the organization and to the world itself, to those that you're not necessarily attached to, but are also trying to perform deeds to help improve humanity, is there a relationship with trust in these commitments?
That's a good question. Actually, would you speak a little bit more about that? And the reason that I ask you to is that I would think trust would be baked into these, acting with integrity and the other commitments. Hopefully, but if you're talking about how do we approach the outside world, do we walk around trusting everybody because that will bring out their best? I wouldn't think that'd be advisable. So maybe you can clarify what your question is, if you would.
I think where I'm coming from is for each of us in relating to the world outside, we are dealing with other elements, and we have to make a determination about those elements in whether or not we are conflicting with them or agreeing with them. Even if we don't quite understand them, that we must cooperate even in creating an ethical society with potentially other individuals that are outside the organization or may not have the same specific agenda. And I think where I'm coming from is if the overall agenda isn't identical, but you have these periods or specific goals for a very specific I guess the word goal, if you have a very specific goal, as in climate change or poverty or anything else with other organizations, the level of trust that is baked into the ethical society to what degree is that a part of the commitment?
I guess I would have to say it's baked into it that at least in terms of people, I think when you join a community, maybe the first thing you say is, can I trust these people? Are these people who respect who I am? Will they honor who I am, or do they not? And that's, to me, is just common adaptive practices. Anybody, who survives in this world has to ask themselves that question. But then as you begin to develop not just the habit of coming, but you begin to know people, then that level of trust will build. And now I feel like I can trust almost everybody in this room. Maybe not those who just joined us today, but keep coming back, and I'll be happy to trust you later. But I think society right now is suffering from a lack of trust, and that one thing that both conservatives and liberals agree on is they don't trust something. The liberals don't trust big business. The conservatives don't trust government. Each side doesn't trust the other. That they don't think the other side is being honest. That it's using the wrong facts, so-called alternative reality. And I think that's a real problem. I don't know how to get beyond that. That's a problem that a lot of people are thinking about. There are organizations that are trying to breach that gap. I think there's one in Chatham County where they encourage people from different political backgrounds to sit down and dialogue with each other. My only concern is that those people who are willing to do that may not be the problem. Those people may be the ones who are part of the solution, which is good. I mean, any dialogue we have between these opposing sides is a good thing. Does that mean I respect everything someone else has says? No, I respect their right to say it, but I won't necessarily respect or think their side is credible. I don't think I have to do that as a part of my ethical commitment. But I think if I speak down to them, if I accuse them of being morally inferior, then I've really broken the chance for trust and the chance for dialogue. So I don't know if that answers your question, but if not, I'll see you at refreshments. What's that? Yes, I do.
Yeah, I don't see consensus because you see things like in the Senate, one person standing up and blocking important legislation, social legislation. So I don't see it in terms of, at least in the political situation like that. I want to ask you, did you say the British Society no longer exists? Because I visited it in London when I went over there one time. It's no longer in existence?
I think the British Ethical Union doesn't exist as an organization. They built a building that still exists and is still used by groups. I don't know which groups. It's my understanding there's no functioning ethical societies in Britain anymore. I may be wrong. Jan, Dorothy? Okay.
It's a British Humanist Society.
There is?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, one interesting development is that for a long time, the American Ethical Union joined forces to create the International and Ethical Humanist Movement. And in recent years, the IHEU dropped the ethical, and that was somewhat of an affront to those of us who like the ethical part of it. But now it's called the International Humanist Union. And we're still a part of it. We still dialogue with them. But that sort of reflects some of the history of, is it focused on, and sometimes the more words you have, the more complicated it sounds. So the British humanist sounds very, and even though ethical culture is trying to move from ethical culture to ethical humanism, there are still people who like both terms, and maybe someday we'll quit using both terms, but that may not be in my generation. Yes.
We have actually a comment from John Holmgren in our Zoom audience, which I will read. In the past, our society has, in a few cases, chosen to remove membership from an individual. The reason in each case was that the individual violated one or more of the commitments in a way that was not in keeping with membership in EHST. Do members consider such removal of a member an ethical action consistent with the 8 commitments? Bombshell of a question.
Good question, John. Thank you very much for that. Yeah, okay. But, you know, one of our goals here is to have a community focused on ethics and humanism. And back to Solomon's statement about trust, we trust that people come here in good faith and wish to pursue those things themselves, but sometimes people come here with their own agendas. And if their own agendas do not mesh with creating a community of people, then I think we have the right to discuss their membership and whether or not they should continue, and to work with them to see if they wish to change whatever it is they're doing. But if they don't, then I think any community congregation has the right to ask someone to leave. I can only think of one. John said he thought of a couple. I can think of one where this person's presence was so disruptive. He would come in with a big bowl of chips and eat the chips and make noises while we were meeting. You know, clearly he didn't have a shared value of what we were trying to do. He was more interested in disrupting it. So I think any organization has a right to remove those people, but I think it should be a deliberative process, not a top down, not one person deciding. But it's difficult, and I hope we don't have to do that anytime in the near future.
I was confused on number 8. You start off this first statement there, although, but then there's no end to that. It's just although this, but then. So are you saying that, to me, it sounds like the ethical society is okay for us becoming religious at death?
No.
I mean, that's what it says there. It says, although
Well-
awareness of impending death intensifies the human quest.
Oh, I say this is a problem with commas, I think.
Yeah, maybe, because it's like life
saying the
itself
awareness of
inspires a
death.
natural religious response.
So I think the proper interpretation is that the although ending with human quest is one statement, but it's not meant, but the awareness of impending death is not meant to also apply to the other parts of that. So I believe the proper reading of that is the mystery of life itself and the need to belong are the primary factors motivating religious human experience. So death, I think they're saying impending death may have some impact on that, but these other factors, the mystery of life itself and the need to belong.
Yeah.
Right. Right. That's, in fact, that's been one of the bones of contention that people have with ethical culture, ethical humanism, is that we do consider ourselves a religion, but not in the traditional sense. You know, you've heard it said, if it walks like a duck and quacks like a duck, it's a duck. Well, for us, well, not for us in this congregation, but we used to have an ethics for children program, and ethics teaching one's children in a community congregation what your ethical values are is a part of anything that in the US that's considered a religion. And in fact, there was a couple of cases, one case in Texas, the state of Texas tried to deny the Austin Society the right to consider itself a religion because it did not talk about God, and they ended up winning the suit. And part of that was that it's not necessary to believe in God to be religious. It's only a matter, you have to have core principles, you have to have values. If you teach them to your children, those are the things that constitute more of a religious response, religion itself. But of course, nobody can really define religion in the US because that just doesn't work. So all these judicial decisions tend to, shoot around the edges, but nobody has really, maybe the new Supreme Court will tell us what religion is.
You haven't spoken yet.
Hi, first time here in many, many years. I'd just like to offer a couple thoughts on the topic that was presented. I forget which number it was, of choice.
Yes.
And I'm totally on board with choice in a number of ways, one of which is it leads directly to responsibility, right? We have responsibility for our choices. But philosophically, it's a difficult word, and we often think of it as an either or. You either have free will or determinism. But much of the research in the last 20, 30, 40 years, even going back to Freud, has to do with the unconscious. And a lot of neurology is now supporting that there are many, many unconscious determinants of behavior. So what I'm coming to the thought I want to offer is I'm coming to this sense that my choice, my ability to make good choices is best when I'm self-reflective enough to begin to understand the unconscious parts of things and be in line with the better parts of those. And that so that choice that then is not just as part of my frontal lobe operating intellectually and philosophically, but addresses the whole complexity of the brain, both the conscious and unconscious parts.
Yeah.
So that's the thought.
Well, that brings to mind one of the things I did prior to my career was with computers, but one of the things I did prior to that was that I worked at a group home with mentally retarded, behaviorally disturbed adults. These adults were not given the benefit of good genetics. They were screwed from birth. And one woman, I won't say her last name, her name is Wanda, has a lot of memories in my brain. She had visual hallucinations, and she would also have she would hear things. And sometimes all you could do was restrain her. She had no choice. She had no ability. So there are people that are like that. By the way, Milleril made a real difference in her life. After that, she was better at making choices. She was much more rational. So again, the brains we're born with, sort of deal us a deck of cards. I've heard it say, some people say, it's 60% genetics, 40% choice, with the other way around. What I do like about I wish I could have found Stephen Hawking's quote, because he said that we really can't prove if we have free will or if it's all deterministic, but until we can, we should act as though we do have free will. So those of us who are blessed with good genetics, I think have the responsibility to do the best they can with the choices they have. Yes.
Hey, so that's kind of a topic that I resolved for myself a while back, and probably nobody can convince me I'm wrong, which is that unconscious factors, environmental factors, history, biological factors, all kinds of things. I don't believe we actually have free will, but I believe we have to act as if we do, just like you just said, because your life would be really hard to live if you thought that was sitting there waiting for the determined thing to happen instead of acting. So I think that's my answer to it. We probably don't have free will, but if we pretend we do, it's better.
One Stephen Hawking quote I did run across, I think was funny. He said, though he's noticed that those people who don't believe in free will still stop and look both ways before they cross the street.
Did you still want to say something? Excuse me.
This is a comment back to Solomon's question about trust. And I'm thinking that the principles of assigning value and dignity to every human, as well as the quote about acting to bring out the best in others, kind of wraps up trust right there. You have to be open to others' best behavior in order to live up to those two statements?
As many of you know, I've been communicating with a man, I'll just say his first name, David, who's in prison. He was sent to prison for murder when he was, I think, 19 years old. He's now 60. He's not the same man that he was then. Some people would argue, well, he took someone's life. He deserves to stay in prison the rest of his life. But in attributing dignity and worth, making that a choice that I make, I think he still has value and dignity as a human being. He's not the same person. He has indicated to me that he really regrets what happened. So again, one's environment, the environment he was raised in, the expectations, it involved a robbery where he got a little bit too excited and pulled the trigger. So how many people, we may not know many people in that situation, but I can assure you there are a lot of people in jail now who have there because they did not make the good choice, first of all, not to do what they were doing. And then when they did that, they made a split second choice that ended the life of someone else. So
Okay.
I do want to go on to somebody, but we can
We're gonna
come back around. Who's
these
next?
Last two questions, because it's beyond quarter of.
Go ahead.
This is regarding what Mary said. If what she said was true, then we are living in a matrix world.
Which do you want, the red pill or the blue pill?
I once taught a class for quite a few years at Oregon State University on difference, power, and discrimination.
Mhm.
And at the beginning of class, I had a huge enrollment for some reason. It was great that students were interested in that. And I sent around a paper and I said, write down your biases and we'll put it in a sealed envelope, fold it, put your name on it, and then at the end of class, we'll hand it back. And you can see if you still have those same biases. Almost every student wrote they didn't have any. And this is about, are we driven by subconscious or whatever? And then at the end of class, I said, okay, write down your biases. And then I would hand them back the paper that they wrote at the first of class. And there are things that for me and in class and then students who are college age classmates could understand, instead of a discussion of free will and subconscious inputs and things like that, they understood a bias. And that's a subconscious thing that either we've learned is built in some ways. And I said, you don't get graded on whether or not you keep those biases that I might not agree with. You get graded on whether or not you recognize that you have them.
Yeah.
And I kept to that promise. There was one guy from Australia who had the worst terrible biases in all the world, but he recognized them, listed them, and said he wanted to keep them. I don't know if he was just testing me on that, but I gave him an A in the class because he kept them, he knew why, and he could express why. He was a horrible kid. I don't know what, but he fulfilled that, but he was the only student in hundreds over years who actually did that. But my point was, sometimes if we think of them as biases and wondering if we have them and that they run us subconsciously, but we don't realize it, and try to recognize them. Where did this come from? Do I really want to keep it? It seemed to be a really good practice for a lot of young people and for me too.
That reminds me, a book we read a couple of years ago, and thanks to John Holmgren, who made us aware of it. I think it was Jonathan Haidt. He wrote his analogy about humans making choices was that our emotions are an elephant, and we're the riders on the elephant. We are the intellect on top of that elephant. And we can't really make the elephant do whatever we want, but we can do things to influence it. And so I really think that's a good analogy. It takes in consideration those psychological factors that do have, an impact on how we behave. But again, maybe we can kick it just the right way and make it go in the right direction. I see people still with their hands up. I don't know. I'll leave it up to Linda as to when to call time
I feel
or.
like we could go on and on and on. It seems like I had to speak two up. I think, for the last, and then your hands go up.
Linda has just closed the discussion, so we're going to send her up front.
Okay, if I'll be happy to chat with any individual that wants to after this when we're doing refreshments. So, all right, thank you. Yes. All right.
Do we have any announcements? No? Yes, Jan.
Dorothy's helped organize us in doing a postcard writing project to ask and remind people to vote in the upcoming election, register and vote. And it's under the auspices of the AEU, and they would like a little bit of publicity with it. So I brought my packet of postcards, and I would like 3 or 4 volunteers just to join me around the table so we can get a picture or two of us doing a group project. We can do it after the meeting. So please join us.
Well, it looks like the sun keeps trying to come out, so we hope Providence smiles on our baseball expedition this afternoon, so we can take off after this. And at the will call window, there are 8 tickets for us, and I can pick them up with my ID, so I would give the tickets to you. So that's how that would go at the will call window. And if you're late, my cell number was in the mailing here. You could call me and I'll meet you. If anybody's very, very late, like the game started, just give me a call. All right. Baseball. Go Durham Bulls. Yay.
Well, I want to thank our greeters, Ben and Mel Macon, and Jennifer, who did opening words, and she'll be doing closing words also. And Gretchen Nyber for doing refreshments. And our Zoom fill-in, it says, is Mara Bright. So
Just a quick brief announcement, because I almost forgot. Next week is a meeting in person. It's going to be the first Sunday of the month. So bring food for the IFC pantry. Thank you, Amy. Also, next Sunday, it's going to be a little bit of an interactive program. We're going to build on some of what Chris talked about today to talk about personal ethics and this sort of thing. Jan is going to be helping run this program. We're expecting a wonderful program because of that. And it is again in person.
hey, Jennifer.
Will be very quick. Whoops, I didn't want to do. So following up again with Dr. Cornell West, the first, and I forgot to say, I'm sorry, the first quote was talking about how consumerism impacts us in a way where we can't form meaningful relationships. So just to keep that in mind. So the closing words, in his activist spirit, he has, I think it's a podcast now called Hope on a Tightrope. So the quote starts, when ordinary people wake up, elites begin to tremble in their boots. They can't get away with their abuse. They can't get away with their subjection. They can't get away with their subjugation. They can't get away with their exploitation. They can't get away with domination. It takes courage for folks to stand up. So just keeping that in mind.
Okay, so our meeting's over, but our fellowship continues. And it looks like Gretchen has come up with another terrific spread. Thank you. And please give a warm greeting to the person next to you. Smile, an elbow bump. And then join us for refreshments.